Hey, que pasa, Calexico? Welcome back to the podcast. Like always, before we begin, I want to thank a couple of people. I want to thank Sergio Armenta. Thank you for sponsoring the podcast. I also want to thank David Gastelum. If you're thinking of buying or selling a home in the Imperial or San Diego County, make sure to call David, 760-235-9576. And lastly, I want to thank all the essential workers, all those nurses, police officers, firefighters, people stocking our supermarkets, all those essential workers that are out there putting, themselves out there in risk, to keep us safe and fed and, everything that we need to be a little bit normal in these hard times. Today's guest is somebody that, I've been trying to get a hold for a while, but, I've heard that he's really, really hardworking man. And I'm really thankful that he took this time for me today. I want to thank Eduardo Garcia for being here today. Thank you for taking this time. So before we begin, can you tell a little bit about yourself? I know that from what I heard, you have, a lot of roots here in the Valley. You can really compare, your growing up to us here in the Valley, even though you didn't grow up here in the Valley, but we have a lot of similarities. And when it comes to, being somebody from migrant parents, living in a desert, all these things that we have in common from, your constituents here in the Valley.
So, as you mentioned, thank you for having us or for reaching out to us on a number of occasions to have us on your show. We're happy that we finally have connected, and it's great to be able to meet you and certainly talk to your audience in Imperial Valley. My name's Eduardo. I was born and raised in the Coachella Valley, but my parents are from Mexicali. My dad grew up in La Colonia Orizaba, and my mother in La Colonia Pueblo Nuevo. And so many of our relatives remain living in Mexicali or live throughout Imperial County. In fact, growing up in the Coachella Valley, I had no family growing up in Coachella. In fact, every Saturday morning, there wasn't even a question in terms of what we were doing that weekend. We were jumping on my dad's little 1984 Nissan Datsun, all three of us, myself, my mom, and I, and driving down to Mexicali through 111 because Highway 86 wasn't fully built yet. And so, I grew up in Coachella, spent a lot of, as I mentioned, my weekends in Mexicali, and a lot of my school breaks, my summer breaks, my Christmas breaks, spring breaks, I actually got to spend them in Imperial County with familia in Westmoreland or in Hopeville. My cousins, Martinez family, who grew up and still live right across the street from the baseball field. There on Holt Avenue. And so a lot of my summer breaks were hanging out with my cousins, either in Mexicali or in the Imperial Valley. But I grew up in Coachella, went to the public schools there. Those who know me know that we were involved in sports, soccer, baseball, football. And they also know that I wasn't probably the honor roll student when I was going to school. I knew that I needed to do enough to play sports to get a 2.0, but never beyond that, because my interest was not always centered around my education. And I'll share a little bit about that as we continue the conversation in terms of how reflecting on that, it takes me back to my time spent at the community college in College of the Desert, having to make up a lot of that time that wasn't invested smartly and strategically during my time in middle school or high school. But growing up in Coachella, I grew up for first 10 years of my life as a single child or only child, and then soon came my younger brother, who's 10 years younger than I am. He's an artist, musician, loves to sing and dance and write his music. performs all over Southern California, including the Coachella Music Festival and then a couple of events in Imperial County, the Rib Cook-Off being one of his annual events where he performs. But my parents, as I mentioned, are from Mexicali. They ended up in Coachella as a result of following the season, the work season in the agricultural fields. They started off in Imperial County, went through Coachella, and interestingly enough, on May 3rd, I actually drove up to Sacramento as we got back to the legislative session, and on the way, 8-hour drive, get to make a lot of phone calls and talk to a lot of people. And somewhere along the lines, I got a call from my mom, and as I was driving past Bakersfield and all of those small little towns that are there, and she was remembering her time with my dad and other members of our familia and friends who they used to, come together to follow the crops and the work. Then she shared with me something that I was not aware and familiar with, where she actually met my dad working in the fields up here in the Central Valley. They met in the Bakersfield area and then went on to work in the Salinas Valley, where there they courted one another, and from that season of work went back to Mexicali as a boyfriend and girlfriend, and eventually married, and on one of those trips to work in the fields in the Coachella Valley decided that that's where they would call home. And so that was interesting how that happens. I just learned that a month or so ago from a casual conversation with my mother as I was driving up to Sacramento for work early in last month. But I mentioned community college. I'm a product of the community college system after graduating from Coachella Valley High School several decades ago, 1995 to be exact. That's when I graduated from high school. And I spent some time prior to enrolling into the community college working, which was one of my aspirational goals after graduating from high school. It wasn't to continue with school, it was to get to work. And I did so. I worked at a retirement home in a dining room. I worked at the Marriott as a guest services representative. And I always tell people that job for me was so important because as I decided to enroll in the community college and I started taking general education classes, or even before that, it was my remedial classes, reading and writing and math classes that I needed to brushing up on because of, I like to, look back and be honest, because of the lack of effort and work that I didn't do in high school. I had to make up for it at the community college. And so I got to spend almost 4 years at the community college prior to being eligible to transfer to the university. And I used to be embarrassed of saying I spent 4 years at the community college before going on to university, but realizing that there are people that spend a lot more time there for a lot of different reasons, not just because they weren't ready and they had to take classes at the beginning of the remedial level, but because they're working, because of life circumstances, right? Because of economic reasons that are kind of out of our control. So realizing though, but those 4 years really prepared me to go on to the University of California, Riverside, where there I spent 2 years and exactly 2 years on getting my bachelor's degree in political science. I was always interested in government and history. And I got minors in both Chicano studies and Native American studies, where my goals at that time were to go back and teach at the high school that I actually got to graduate from, which is Coachella Valley High School. And I did get to do that right upon graduating from UCR, and also did some work in the adult education school, which really motivated me to get into public service, along with a couple of internships that I did. One in high school, my junior year, where I actually was a audio tech person at the Coachella City Hall, where I actually videotaped the city council meetings. And that planted the seed in terms of wanting to pursue public office, as a crazy idea, saying, someday I'm going to be the mayor of this town. And everyone thought I was nuts. No one, has the aspirations to be the mayor of a town at the time. People responded to me. And then another internship that I did later on in my college years was with a tribe. And the tribe is the Cabazon Band of Mission Indians, who owns and operates the Fantasy Springs Casino there in Indio. And that internship was in their government affairs department, where I got to learn about tribal sovereignty, intergovernmental relationships between the tribes and the local and county government entities. And I became interested in that area, which is why I pursued the degree in Native American Studies at the university, was to really kind of get a better understanding, a more formal and historical perspective on the history of tribes in California and across the country. So that's a little bit about like my educational background, my little bit of some early on work experience in my early journey as a college graduate. But I got to tell you, today I get to work as a legislator, a lawmaker here in Sacramento, representing what is the hometown of many of my relatives in Imperial County, and where my mom and dad worked tirelessly in the fields, and where I was born and raised. And it's an honor to be able to serve in this capacity. Not an easy task, similar to any other job, right? There's the dynamics, both of the human dynamics, the needs, the wants, the priorities, and making decisions that aren't always going to be popular and or accepted by all, and trying to balance those things along with the politics of the decision-making process, right? Politics is kind of what happens in the process of getting to an end goal of what our priorities are. And so that's a little bit about me. I'm married, happily married. I have a wife, Stephanie. I have a stepdaughter, Taylor, who's 16. I have a son who's 16. And then we have a little daughter. Her name is Ella, more famously known as Ella from Coachella. She even has her little hashtag, Ella from Coachella. And so she's been running around with me the entire time that I've been in the state legislature, at events, activities, has traveled to Sacramento with me, and also loves to eat burritos de machaca from the sopes y flautas place there in Calexico and in El Centro. So that's a little bit about me. I feel, even though I wasn't born and raised in Imperial County, even though I didn't go to the schools there, right? I feel very connected and very rooted to Imperial County. And I think that's why, if you look at the things that we work on through the work as a lawmaker, we've prioritized the things that are important and that impact, people directly, like air quality issues, water quality issues, the issue of economic development and investment in the area, because we know that those are big issues that the people of Imperial County face on a daily basis. And so thank you for the question, and certainly great again to be on your show. And that's how we started, and I'll kind of summarize it with that again.
You mentioned making decisions that not always go well with everybody that you represent. I was reading up on the how many constituents you have, and you have around, well, according to Wikipedia, there's 165,000 more or less. Am I right? Or
so we represent a district. There are 80 assembly districts, and then there's 40 Senate districts in the state, and then you've got the executive office, which is the governor. In each assembly district, you actually have close to 500,000 residents that we represent. And in the Senate, it's almost closer to 1 million. So you can imagine almost 500,000 people that we represent of all ages, of all backgrounds and both religious beliefs and cultures that come into this place of how do we set priorities for our region that people will all agree on, and that's near to impossible. But how do we prioritize things that will have an impact on the majority of the people that we represent in the district is more of the approach that we like to take.
I'm trying to tie in that with, the number of constituents, how to make decisions. Trying to tie in that with the census. How does the census, making sure people fill out the census, how does it help you and everybody in the state, in the capital, make more decisions, to better suit everybody?
So that's a good question, because we are in the season, right, of promoting the census and making sure that everyone ensures that they're accounted for. How the census plays a role is very, very clear. It designates the amount of resources that go to specific places in our country. And depending on population, right, that's how they break down the investments that are made in public safety and healthcare and education and infrastructure like roads and bridges and things of that sort. And so it also plays a role in, as you have growing communities, the amount of people that live there also determine the way that boundaries for elected office are set up. So, for example, the congressional seat in our area, the Assembly and the Senate seat, and those same numbers get utilized as you draw boundaries for districts at local level elections, right? To make sure that they are distributed fairly on socioeconomic boundaries along with populations. And so people accounting for themselves in the census has a tremendous amount of implications on the money that we receive, but also on the landscape of what the politics, the boundaries of these districts look like when it comes down to it. The Assembly, the Senate, and in some instances, the data that is collected is oftentimes used also to set up districts locally for county board of supervisors and things of that sort. So, I mean, there's a lot of reasons why the census is important. And I think today more than ever, it becomes even more important when we're looking at the needs that we have during this pandemic crisis of COVID-19. The need for greater healthcare infrastructure and services alone, I think, has come to the forefront of the crisis, and of course, how the census also plays a role.
Yeah, and kind of like moving into that, COVID. How would that? Because here in Calexico, here in Imperial Valley in general, you've seen how hospitals have been impacted with patients with COVID-19. Here in Calexico, we don't even have a hospital. How does the census, how does getting people counted for could eventually help out Calexico get a hospital or get more money to build bigger hospitals here in the valley?
So the numbers, right, are reported to the federal government, right? And in order to make clear assessments of population that's existing and population projections that are to come, right? You can, based on patterns of growth, right, and development, you can also project more or less how many people we will have by X, Y, and Z year, right? And so for purposes of this conversation, being able to provide that data, it goes to the appropriate federal agencies that are making decisions on ensuring that federally qualified healthcare centers are receiving the adequate funding to take care of the population that we're speaking of, in this case, whether it be Calexico or the entire border region of Imperial County. So that's the most practical way of sharing with you how significant that is. Of course, moving to other areas we have border infrastructure needs, whether it be, the expansion of the port of entries to get goods movements flowing safely, but also making sure that, vehicles and trucks are not idling for hours, that are not only interrupting economic progress, but also are causing some environmental problems with the air, right? The quality of the air, and impacting the public health of people who live along the border. And so those types of things play into the population growth, the demographics, of making sure that government, in this case the federal government, is making the appropriate investments to the region. Another reason why making sure that people are accounted for in the census is critical.
How do we, because here in the Valley, Calexico especially, we have this issue. It's not an issue, but we live in the border. California has probably one of the highest rates when it comes to property ownership. People can't afford to pay a mortgage or to pay a rent. So here in the Valley, we have this thing where we have a lot of people who are U.S. citizens, but in order to survive, they go to Mexicali to rent where it's cheaper. How do we help these people stay here? That way, they get counted that way, because at the end of the day, we saw that, they're using our services. U.S. citizens that are living in Mexicali are coming down to the Imperial Valley to get treated for let's say COVID. Right now, we're dealing with this pandemic. So how do we, help out these people to get affordable living, affordable housing?
So California, without a question, is an expensive place to live. Right? It is an expensive place to live for a lot of different reasons. And one of the unique things about where we live and the area that I get to represent, and you're speaking of Calexico as one particular location, but really the region as a whole, relatively speaking, in comparison to other parts of the state, are affordable, but yet still not affordable for the majority of working families in our district. And so what do we got to do? Well, the issue of building more housing certainly can attribute to making it more attainable from the standpoint of supply and demand and keeping costs at a reasonable level. But really, it goes back to what are we doing and what can we do more of? And this is a conversation I had earlier today with a member of Governor Newsom's executive team related to the COVID-19 situation in Imperial and Riverside County, where how do we bring greater investment to our region to improve the quality of jobs and salaries for people to actually be able to afford to live nearby their place? And without a doubt, that conversation is interconnected with our educational programs and services, and how well we are preparing our students, whether it be to go into the workforce or to go on to higher education, and create the opportunities for them in order to return back to the region, to add greater value, not just as professionals, but also the value that they bring to be able to obtain a possible professional career in whatever they studied, to increase the opportunities, right, of economic mobility, and be able to afford the homes that are being built in Imperial County. So this crisis and the current circumstances of COVID-19 is shedding a lot of light on the many challenges that we have in our border region. And that was the message to the executive representative of Governor Newsom's team that I spoke with today. I said, we're having these challenges with COVID-19. Our numbers continue to increase. We're still not able to fully open up the economy because of that. But here's the deal. Our challenges come way before COVID-19, with economic challenges as it relates to our unemployment rates, as it relates to our inability to attract investment that's going to bring good quality paying jobs for the people who live in Imperial County, to then be able to, again, afford to live and buy a home in Imperial County. And so, right now, much of the work in the legislature has been narrowed down to economic recovery type of legislative proposals, and of course, reactive proposals to COVID-19 crisis and expanding healthcare services in areas that need it the most. And without a doubt, also looking at how the issue of the digital divide is playing a role into all of that, not just the distance learning challenges that we're seeing in our educational institution, but also the delivery of healthcare via, these technologies like we're doing here today, or for that matter, the need for this type of technology to also be in the hands of our small businesses to be able to survive in this particular climate and moving forward. So long answer to your question, more specifically, bringing more investment, tying it and aligning it to our educational institutions to prepare, the workforce and be able to ultimately create greater value and economic upward mobility for people to actually be able to live in Imperial County. And I recognize that some people by choice work here in the United States and live in Mexico, but there's a lot of people that would prefer, right, to live here if they could afford to live here and really take on the cost of being able to live here. So that's a really good question. A lot of work that we have to do in that area. And I think that we have to look at this crisis as an opportunity to really shed light on the many challenges that we have in our border region and that we've had for decades, right? It isn't the unemployment issue in Imperial County wasn't born right before the COVID-19 or after the COVID-19. We've had decades long of, chronic high unemployment rates for a lot of different reasons. But I think it's time and an opportunity to actually do something about it.
You talk about education. We know that, due to COVID and, the circumstances we're in, our budget took a big hit, or is going to take a big hit. And being somebody that's worked in education for the past 20 years, it felt like we were finally, getting our heads out of the water, feeling a little bit, more able to provide materials, whether it's technology, whether it's, paper, like day-to-day materials. How is this, budget crisis going to affect, or what is the state doing to limit the impact on, education?
So we have what we all refer to, right, as a point of reference as Proposition 98, right, in California, that secures that whatever funding goes to schools has a certain commitment by Proposition 98, ensuring that based on revenues coming in, that here is the allocation that goes to our public education system. Right? There's probably some teachers out there that could summarize it much better than I can, but nevertheless, it secures certain levels of funding for public education, depending on the revenues that the state of California is having. So on good years, right, Proposition 98 delivers on making sure that we are fully funding and exceeding in some areas the level of investment that we're making to public education for purposes of classrooms and teacher salaries and making sure that the programs and services are really fully funded. California has always been challenged in that arena, 45th, 46th of the 50 states when it comes to public education funding, and up until recently, making some strides in improving on those statistics and those levels of investment. Clearly, with revenues in California down, that means that will have a significant impact on all of the investments that we make on a reoccurring basis. The Senate and the Assembly has countered the governor's budget proposal, the $54 billion shortfall for this coming year, with saying, hey, we've got to use more of our rainy day funds and our reserves to not impact things like public education. And so this week, there will be some deliberation on the proposals coming from the Senate and the Assembly to counter a lot of the cuts, somewhere in the range of like $10 billion of cuts that were proposed and the governors may revise for public education that hurts, regions like ours the most, given the limited funding sources that exist locally. Property taxes, right, don't fund entirely our public education locally, right? It's the state support that we receive and other funding sources that come to our public education institutions. And so we're doing everything. We're part of conversations to come up with other funding mechanisms through different avenues to make sure that we're not cutting things like public education or our services to our seniors, or for that matter, that we're not cutting services for people with developmentally disabled circumstances. I mean, they're really the populations that need us the most, and we got to make sure that we don't impact those programs and services for those targeted populations. And public education really making up a large portion of the state, budget. We have to make sure that we protect those investments. We've made some really important strides in the last couple of years in improving the amount of money that we invest in our classrooms and trying, of course, to reduce classroom sizes. And we've made some strides. There have been some efforts also to improve, facilities with the passing of school bonds and local voters also supporting improving facilities locally. I know there's some great work going on at Calexico High School and the Unified School District and other school districts who have program improvements to the facilities. The environment in which our students are learning in matters. It makes a significant difference. And so we have to continue in those lines of thinking. But we are forecasting some really difficult financial times. And I think across the board, cities and counties and school districts are projecting some really challenging times. But, for us, we have to set those priorities. And as I mentioned earlier, we ultimately have to narrow down what our priorities are. And what most people agree on is making sure that things like public education continue to be fully funded to the best and the most that we can.
Earlier you spoke about, air pollution, air quality here in the Valley. I know recently you secured some money, the money that was set for the new river. Because this kind of ties into where we're at in terms of, our population at the hospitals and, COVID. We know that COVID-19 affects, the lungs, affects, people who have unhealthy lungs. And we live in an area where, due to the border, due to the New River, due to Salton Sea, all this kind of ties into how our population is being affected the most in terms of this disease. Like you said earlier, the issues with our unemployment aren't something that wasn't started with COVID or just before COVID. The issues with the Salton Sea and the New River isn't something that's new either. And then now with the budget cuts and all these things going on, how is the progress, going to continue in working with, the New River, Salton Sea? How are we going to keep that a focus now that, we're going through all these hard times?
So look, the way that we've been able to bring greater attention to the issues happening in our region have been through the lens of public health and how these air quality issues, these water quality issues are affecting the public health of the people who live in our district. And we started framing the issues in that manner in 2015, 2016, when I first was elected to this position, because I realized that much of the conversation in Sacramento and in the more affluent communities of the state, when they're talking about protecting the environment, they were talking about, protecting our oceans and our trees and endangered species. And that right there, that message, although it's important and it resonates with folks, even in our district, it doesn't resonate as strong as talking about the many kids in Imperial County or Eastern Riverside County who have asthma. That includes my 5-year-old little girl. And that people with compromised immune systems are more likely to suffer from other types of health problems. And in this particular time, we're talking about COVID-19, people being more susceptible to catching the virus because of their compromised immune system and their lungs not operating in full capacity. So when making arguments in Sacramento about why we need to prioritize these types of issues like funding for the new river, we're able to make that argument very clear cut, and people are empathetic to the circumstance, and also understanding that these have been problems that have been prevailing without any real resolution for decades in our region. And so, right now we're 10 days away finding out in the final budget that's to be signed by the governor by June 15th by law, whether or not the $28 million in its entirety stay in the budget for the new river. I'm very optimistic about it, that it will, because we've made our case in the Assembly, in the Senate. And right now, the biggest champion for that, aside from our representatives locally, our nonprofit organizations working on this issue, and the residents of Calexico and Imperial County that have been dealing with this issue, is the administration. I gotta give the administration a lot of credit for seeing the connection between the public health crisis that's before us, the public health crisis that's been in existence because of a problem like the New River and the Salton Sea, and that they're also making the commitments to invest in these projects. And so look, the $28 million for the New River isn't going to solve the entire problem, but it's going to address the first phase of cleanup in the Calexico community, the people who have directly been impacted the most, and where we can talk to families who can tell you that they believe that, the passing of a member of their family or a disease that they've had to deal with that has to do with cancer or other type of, diseases is attributed to the environmental problem of the New River. And, that to me is significant enough to have made this a priority. And we were talking about a football game, we're like at the 10-yard line, and we were like on second down, we've got like two more, plays to call to get into the end zone and score. And I feel really good about it. But look, we are also planning a plan B and a plan C and looking to our federal partners in making sure that they back up our effort. It's a binational cross-border issue where it's the federal government that has a huge responsibility and liability along with the state. So, we're pushing, and we're hopeful that it ends up in the budget to be able to get this project off the ground in the next year or so.
What can the community do to kind of like push this, like help this get pushed through?
So I'll tell you, over the last 2 weeks, the community has been very involved, really engaged. There were 2 hearings in the Senate and in the Assembly where a lot of members of the community, organizations that have been working on the issue, and city and county leaders were calling in live to show their support for the proposal and the budgets. And now the focus will be to write and call the governor's office to ensure that it stays in the final negotiations of the budget that we will be voting on in the next week or so, and ultimately making sure that the money is secured and that we can get these projects like the New River Phase 1 improvement plan built in Calexico. To me, I was on the phone today with a Calexico native who works here in Sacramento. His name is Marcos Lizárraga. He runs La Cooperativa Campesina, an organization connected to the organizations like CET that does training, workforce training. He grew up on the border. He grew up in Mexicali, Calexico. And as a kid, he said to me, because he was excited to see how close we are to potentially securing this funding in the budget. He contracted polio at an early age, and he believes that it was from the toxic waste that flows through the New River where they used to play as kids. And so, those types of stories, they resonate, right? They resonate to the point that you commit yourself to this kind of work and you don't let go, right? And we're going to keep pushing because even after the $28 million, if God willing, it's secured and the support of the governor, it's in the budget, we have another project that involves the New River, and that's potentially building a treatment plant on this side of the border to clean up the other parts of the New River, right? And making sure that the water flowing into the salted sea is cleaner than what it currently is today, to also help with those efforts as it relates to water flows to the Salton Sea to mitigate the drying up areas. And I mean, that's a whole other conversation, but nevertheless, there's more to be done even after the securing of $28 million is really the point that I'm trying to make, along with the story that I share about a Calexico native who I spoke to today, who was really excited to see how close we are to being able to secure this first phase of funding.
Something that also, you mentioned about, immunocompromised people that, are affected because of COVID-19. How does the state promote healthier living? A lot of people, especially people of color, are affected with diabetes, heart problems, but yet, especially in the Hispanic communities, people are a little bit afraid of going to the doctor because of medical bills. Just that, culture where like, oh no, nothing's going to happen to me. How do you as a state, help promote, or help these people, get to the doctor?
So the first part of all this is, promoting access to healthcare, right? And making sure that people have the ability to be insured, have some kind of coverage, which is why, California stood strong and behind the Affordable Care Act that was, put into play by former President Barack Obama at the federal government level. And then at the state level, it was Covered California, making sure that as many people as possible have insurance, right? Or some type of plan to be able to access, care. At the same time, we talk a lot about there are still pockets of people who are uninsured. And many times it's our hardworking, undocumented population in California, right? People working as essential workers during this COVID-19 crisis in the fields or in other, trades like construction or hospitality industries. It is said that there's approximately 50 to 60% of those individuals working in those specific industries that are working without the proper documentation. And so how do we make sure that they too have access to healthcare, which is why the state slowly has been expanding its ability to provide healthcare insurance to those who are working in California, who are paying into the tax system and the Social Security system under their ITIN numbers, right? To also have access to healthcare. So that's one thing that we've been doing. The other thing really is promoting the idea of continuing to build the healthcare infrastructure, making sure that we are expanding the actual industry of healthcare. We need to build more hospitals, or for that matter, build more primary care type of facilities so that people don't end up in the hospital. It's the preventative type of care that we need more of in order to prevent people from ending up in the hospital to be treating their illnesses that many times were illnesses that were preventable if identified early on, right? And so those are the areas that we continue to push on. For me, we've been working very closely with the region to establish a program with the universities to be able to have resident programs for more doctors and medical professionals to come do their residency training in our region, because the likelihood of them staying in the area becomes greater and we continue to build our healthcare infrastructure through capacity of having professionals treating, our folks in Imperial County. And so those are some of the things that we've promoted through legislation, through funding mechanisms, to be able to expand the access. And then, of course, indirectly, I've been really big in championing issues like investing into our park infrastructure. As mayor in Coachella, I was a big proponent of investing into our park systems, fixing the old ones and building new ones. The population had grown, but not the amount of park spaces to accommodate for all the new families and existing families. And so at the state level, I've had the opportunity to work on several big statewide initiatives where we've seen some of the fruits of that work pay off to delivering on some really good announcements that were made over the course of this last year, where some of the cities in our district, including in Imperial County, have received some good sizable grants, Calexico being one of them, $8.5 million grant to refurbish a park in its entirety, where I think currently it is an eyesore in a part of the community that many people live in and have to drive by. Improving our park systems directly and indirectly is a form of promoting health and wellness in our communities, getting people to the near park, and hopefully there's one within proximity of many neighborhoods in town where they can go out and walk with the family, exercise, congregate with their friends. Clearly not during this particular time, but that's been an area of much interest and a priority for us, building parks, refurbishing old parks to be able to promote the issue of health and wellness through recreation as well. So those are ways that we promote, health and wellness as a state, and more specifically, how we've been working on these types of issues to promote public health and wellness. And again, the issue of environmental problems that we face, I've been able to successfully have them agreed upon in Sacramento because we framed them through the lens of public health and the needs that people have.
During this whole pandemic, we noticed that sometimes the states can really rely on the federal government to supply them with medical needs that we need. PPE, for example, for our nurses and doctors. What is the state doing now? Do we have some kind of task force or somebody looking into being better prepared for these kinds of situations?
Absolutely. I think this crisis has pushed us all to, and we're not in full recovery mode yet, right? We're still reacting and responding to the crisis at hand, where you have certain regions of the state that continue to be of concern, right? With numbers continuing to increase and capacity issues. But what we are starting to talk about is reflecting on the response and the preparedness that we had. And one thing is, there have been legislative proposals already that have gone through the process and or budget allocation requests where we actually start stockpiling, certain types of medical equipment that we need, whether it's a very similar crisis or a different crisis of emergency, but that we will need to have stockpiles of not just ventilators or protective, equipment for our professional medical, experts. And but there are other things. I mean, are we supplied enough at our fire departments to be able to respond to certain emergencies? Our emergency services, are our communication systems up to par to be able to respond effectively, right? I mean, there's all this discussion going on. And I think this has been a learning lesson for everyone across the country, including California. But as it relates to, California and the federal government, I mean, we've taken it upon ourselves, and the governor has done the job of really leading us and making some executive decisions some not so popular than others, but he's made the decisions to make some serious investments in making sure that we can supply, those professionals on the ground. And we have a lot of work to do still. I mean, $1 billion were spent on supplies to be able to get out to our essential workers. And that doesn't seem to be enough to address all of the needs in our hospitals, our clinics, our senior health institutes, our grocery workers, our farm workers. I mean, there's a long list of folks who are out there working who are still struggling to obtain some of the protective equipment that they need. And so, yes, there's a work group that's been put together, everything from looking at this current crisis, but also looking at the next crisis. We're a state that unfortunately has seen a series of crises, whether it be the drought that put in place, places in the state where we didn't even have water, and we had to respond to those communities, bring in remote, places for them to fill up for water for basic things like cooking and cleaning and bathing, to the issue of unprecedented amount of fires in the state, right? And so there are a lot of different emergencies that the state has experienced over the last 5-10 years that really forces us to do a better job in preparing. And of course, no one ever expected this biological virus emergency that we have faced that really has had a significant impact on a lot of people, on the economy, and of course, in how we interact with one another moving forward. So that's a really good question where we're going to have a lot of work to do once we are in the more reflective mode of seeing what we could have and should have done different and how we prepare for the next crisis that we may face.
Yeah. We've been focusing a lot on COVID-19. And I just kind of wanted to leave this question towards the end because we're almost at an hour. But we're these last couple of weeks, these last couple of months, we've been, through these historic, events, the COVID, budget crisis, all these things. But something that recently has overshadowed all that is, the killing of George Floyd. Right now everybody is mad, and for good reason. I feel that I don't know. It's something I haven't really talked about this with anybody, and I'm having a hard time because I don't know how. It's what do we do? Like, how do we change? Because I think that right now we're at a point where, excuse my French, but shit has hit the fan. People are tired of it. And it took, somebody recording this gruesome event to, hit this point. So what, I don't know, like, I don't even know what to ask you or how to phrase it. What's your opinion on this?
That, again, we have witnessed a racist act against a Black person that turned out to be fatal, and that there's absolutely no excuse for that type of conduct coming from anyone, and more so from law enforcement, who we expect and depend to protect us. And although we have witnessed this, the longest 8-minute video that you could probably ever witness, and not ignore. But in the early 1990s, we saw another video of another Black man being beat by a multitude amount of police officers in Los Angeles. And we witnessed a jury say they were not guilty. And we also witnessed an uproar and of people saying enough with this injustice system that is biased and racist against people of color. And here we are decades later having to confront and have this discussion again. And look, Racism is real, and it's embedded in many of our institutions, including our police departments. And the only way that that changes is through public policy and through leadership at law enforcement levels to embed a different culture of how we police our communities across the board. But it's real. In the last 2 days, we've seen it firsthand outside this Capitol building in Sacramento on how upset people are. And of course, we don't recognize and celebrate the destruction and the rioting and the looting that has taken place. We promote the protest of the peaceful folks who are making their voice heard very loud and very clear, that the racism in this country is real, that Black people, brown people, and other people of color have faced it for many, many decades, and this video that we all have seen is absolutely horrifying, because I have, a 16-year-old son that we have had to talk to him about how you react and how you behave in circumstances when law enforcement is engaging you to ask you some questions, pull you over, what have you. I have nephews that are biracial who also have had to hear the talk that because of the color of their skin, that they will be treated differently at times by law enforcement or in other types of circumstances. And that's a really difficult conversation to have with young boys and young women, because the racism and discrimination isn't gender neutral. It's across the board, right? And so what I can tell you is this, today I signed a request to co-author a piece of legislation that will make it illegal for anyone to use their knee on a suspect or a detainee under the custody of law enforcement, that no longer be, allowed, and that it be made very clear to law enforcement across the state of California in their academies that right there will end up having you suspended, fired, or for that matter, prosecuted for murder, like the officer who was caught on video doing this to the person in Minneapolis. And so I know it's a difficult subject, but it's a real one that we cannot turn our blind eye to. Because if you've seen that video, it was hard to watch, but just as hard to ignore that this country has a really big stain on it. And it's the history of racism that has affected a lot of people of color, specifically African Americans and people of Latino descent in this country. And so, what's my role? It's continue to push public policy at the state level to improve accountability, transparency when it comes to not just law enforcement, but across the board, discrimination and racism in corporations that happens, right? Gender pay equity issues, right? All those things. I could share with you 2 years ago, we were supporting legislation that forces police departments to disclose information about officers who may have track records of misconduct. And you know what? Law enforcement across the state, police unions across the state, they were not happy with that legislation. And they were lobbying really hard for that legislation for a lot of reasons not to pass. And it passed, and I supported it because I believe that it leads to the preventative stages of seeing an incident like this. This is an officer, if we're talking about the same, situation in Minneapolis, who has 17, 18 other complaints against him, right? At some point, after 2, 3, 4, or 5, there's a red flag. And at what point does leadership in our police department say, this is not a person that's fit to be a defender of the law and a protector of the citizens? A couple years ago, we supported a policy for the cameras, right? For law enforcement agencies to have the cameras and to have that information made available to the public when incidents arise. Law enforcement agencies, not all of them, but a good portion of them, not in support of those issues. It passed and we supported it. And so we got to continue to push those types of policies that make sure that there's transparency and accountability. But again, this isn't an issue that just pertains to law enforcement. Discrimination and racism is real in other institutions of the government, and we've got a lot of work to do in that area.
Yeah. And I mean, I just want to put this out there that, we all know that not all police officers are bad. Although, every police officer that goes out there every day is putting their life on the line, and, we appreciate that. But, there are a few apples that are like this. But the thing is that in this field of profession, there shouldn't be any bad apples because we are depending on them to help us. We need to feel safe, that we're not getting that bad apple coming, to us and treating us the way they treated this man. And
no, you're absolutely right. We cannot blanket, this incident and apply it to that every person who puts on the badge and goes out there and puts their life on the line every night is the same. We can't do that. We know that there are people that genuinely care about the safety and well-being of other people in our communities, and our hats off to them. We've seen police chiefs and sheriffs come out and be outspoken about this incident, and that's what we need more of, along with police officers, so that the community sees their genuine care and interest about addressing this problem that is rooted in police departments up and down our country and in our state and in our backyard. And so when law enforcement comes together with community and the protesters that are out there making their voice heard peacefully, I think that's the beginning of coming up with potential solutions to addressing the problems that we have as it relates to community policing and trust that is lacking today more than ever.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we're at an hour already. And like I said, I wanted to keep it in an hour because I know, you've been working all day and you have something else to do in a little bit. And I wanted to give you a little break in between, this and, whatever you're having to do in a little bit. But anything else that you would like to add that, we didn't touch upon?
Well, look, man, I want to tell you that what a great opportunity this has been, not only to talk to your audience about who we are, the things that we care about in terms of our priorities as a lawmaker and representative for them and the region. Look, we appreciate, serving. Public service wasn't something that, I thought I'd be doing. If you asked me, when I was running around at 16, 17 years old with my cousins in Mexicali at the Forum or hanging out at Hopeville at George's Pizza, right? It was never an idea, right, that I had that I would be in Sacramento representing 500,000 people. And I truly really honor, the responsibility, and I appreciate people allowing me to serve them. We've talked about a lot of things that are important on real time, as the governor would say, he uses the word real time situations. For me, we're dead focused right now on securing that money for the Imperial County as it relates to the new river. we're dead focused on making sure that the state continues to work collaboratively with the county in this particular COVID-19 crisis. There's another testing site that is opening up in Calexico that we want to encourage people to get tested regardless of symptoms or not, because that's going to help us at the end of the day improve our numbers as it relates to positive, negative cases, and ultimately begin opening up the economy in its entirety, right? We have a serious crisis on the other side of the border related to COVID-19 that we have to have some collaboration and communication with folks over there as well to make sure that it doesn't continue to enhance the seriousness of the problem in our region as a whole. And, we, Imperial Valley, Mexicali, we're a region, right? We're a region, and it's hard to use that border fence when we see advantage of people coming over to shop and spend and invest. It's a good thing. But when they want to come over here and use our services, they should stay over there. I mean, we're a region, and we have to look at it that way and work collaboratively in order to address the issues. It's a challenge because we're dealing with two countries and we're dealing with other rules and things of that sort. But
and then also the population difference.
Yeah, we have 1 million people, million-plus people. It's not an easy task, right? And so we're focused on making sure that again, the state is playing its role. And lastly, we also want to make sure that we are accessible, visible, and that folks in Imperial County know that they can count on us and our office if they need any assistance with any state-related agency, unemployment office, the DMV, or any other type of state-related agency. We want to let them know that our office is here to be helpful. And a little plug, Stella Jimenez is our district director. Our office is at the airport. The number to contact our office is 760-355-8656 in case anyone has any questions or any issues related to a state agency. The majority of calls that we've been getting have to do with the unemployment insurance and the status of the application. So we want to encourage folks to give us a call if they have any questions. And with that, I just want to again say thank you, man. I look forward to being able to be part of your show again, to be able to give you an update on what's happening in Sacramento or in the district, and be of service to you and, of course, to the people that are listening in the podcast. So very much appreciative from Sacramento, the state capital of the great state of California, reporting here to duty, as they would say.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Like I said, I know you're super busy. I know you're working hard, and sometimes I'm kind of glad of COVID-19 because it's allowed me to kind of perfect this medium where I can talk to people, because sometimes it's harder to schedule when we're in person, but through Zoom, it's much easier to get in touch with people. I want to thank Aurora for, reaching out, and also Stella. They both reach out to me and try to make this connection. Also, my friend Frank Gumby Salazar, thank you for
our good friend Frank.
Yeah.
From Calexico.
Yeah, thank you, Frank. Thank you for for the connection, and like I said, thank you so much. Keep on working hard like you're doing, and thank you guys for listening. Don't hang up yet, okay? Thank you guys for listening, and we'll see you in the next one. Peace.